Good afternoon, everyone. For the past 9 years, Dr. Michael SCHERFFLER has been exposing young minds at VCU to the vibrant history and cultures of Latin America. His own studies, although centered on the correlation between art and politics in the Hispanic world, cover a wide variety of topics, from the representation of cannibalism to the manifestation of imperial authority in colonial Mexico. Today, though, he joins us to present Threads of Many Colors, Islam, America, and the Visual Culture of Conquest. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to present Dr. Michael SCHERFFLER.
Muchas gracias, Mariam, y me gustaría agradecerles también a los organizadores del Congreso, a la maravillosa ciudad de Córdoba y a todos ustedes por haber venido esta mañana. Gracias y buenos días. My presentation today is on a subject that has been of great interest to me for some time, and as an art historian who works primarily on Latin America, I am grateful to Jonathan and Sheila and to all of the scholars and friends of Islamic art and culture who are here for having welcomed me into your circle so warmly. Thank you. In 1946, the Mexican art historian Manuel Toussaint published Arte Mudéjar en América, a book that grew out of a presentation he made in 1942 at the 27th Congress of Americanists in Mexico City. In it, he surveyed and illustrated architectural forms and ornaments produced in 16th and 17th century Latin America that he believed had formal and technical precedence in the Islamic world. Toussaint's book was, to my knowledge, the first one to survey this set of forms in the Americas, but the subject had been addressed in earlier publications of narrower scope, such as the Spanish art historian Diego Angulo's The Mudéjar Style in Mexican Architecture, published in the journal Ars Islamica in 1935. To these scholars and their contemporaries, the use of the word mudéjar to describe some of the art and architecture of colonial Latin America was largely unproblematic, for they employed it in a way that it had been used since the 19th century and in which it is still used today, to describe art and architecture that to certain viewers looks Islamic, but which was produced in non-Islamic settings or for non-Muslim patrons. But unlike earlier uses of the term, which had centered on works from the Iberian Peninsula, Toussaint and his contemporaries were using it to describe cultural production in a vast geographic area stretching from the USA in the north to Argentina and Chile in the south. Among the works these scholars identified as belonging to this stylistic category were a number of different architectural forms. They looked, for example, at portals and arcades adorned with rectangular moldings, such as this one in the town of Angawa in the state of Michoacan, Mexico. And so I'm pointing out, not easy to do, pointing out the location of this, and then here a detail of the portal itself. It's a portal which probably dates to the 1570s or earlier, and which was made by native Mexican artists from a local pink volcanic stone. Its rich sculpted patterning reminded Toussaint of, quote, the delicacies of the gessos of the Alhambra. Other forms of architectural ornament in colonial Latin America that historians have called mudéjar include decorative brickwork, such as this on the fountain in Chiapa de Corzo, Mexico, which dates to around the 1560s, as well as lobed and mixed linear arches, windows, and portals, such as this one, also from the 16th century at Huejotzingo in central Mexico. And finally, at least two church plans that a number of scholars have linked to that of the Mosque of Cordoba, and I will return to these in just a moment. Among the most widespread of these mudéjar forms in Latin America, though, were wooden ceilings elaborately decorated with intersecting lines that form complex repeating geometric patterns. These ceilings were often polychromed and gilded Toussaint cited examples of such ceilings in Mexico, the place whose colonial-era architecture he knew best, as well as in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. He dated the earliest ones to the 16th century and spoke of them in effusive terms. One such ceiling, that of the Church of Santo Domingo in Quito, Ecuador, so this is the one that I'm showing now, elicited particular excitement from him. "I have called this alfarje prodigious," he wrote, "and I don't regret having done so. This roof is of the purest, most authentic mudéjar that exists in Spain or America," end of quote. That ceiling, which was constructed in the early 17th century and restored in 2002, can still be seen in Quito today. Scholars have criticized the bright colors with which it has been painted since at least the mid-20th century, but an early text indicates that it was polychromed, although perhaps not precisely in this way, at least by 1650. There is, of course, much to say about the scholarly treatment of this and other works in 16th and 17th century Latin America that have been called mudéjar. As critics of the concept have noted, the identification of certain architectural forms as inherently Islamic partakes of an Orientalist point of view that denies cultural variation and change over time. And indeed, some of the scholarship, and particularly the earliest scholarship, adopted this position. Toussaint's description of this ceiling as the, quote, purest and most authentic mudéjar that exists sounds similarly unsophisticated to the reader today, but is perhaps not surprising considering the early date of its publication. In this paper, I would like to put Toussaint's description to the side for a moment and use this colorful example of what some scholars have called the mudéjar iberoamericano, or Ibero-American mudéjar, as a point of departure for an intervention into the historiography on architectural forms in Latin America that have traditionally been viewed as Islamic-looking. And here I'm showing some recent sources on the subject that use this terminology in their titles. I begin with the observation that the issues that dominate recent scholarship in the field are the same ones that were examined by early 20th century art historians. This is not, of course, to say that there have not been great advances in this field of study, for indeed there have been many, and I don't wish to minimize them. But as it did in the 1930s and 40s, scholarship continues to document the existence of Islamic-looking architectural forms in the early modern Americas, and often focuses on questions about how and why they came to be built there. The answers they've proposed for these questions are not controversial. For example, in addressing the question of how ornamental ceilings like the one at Santo Domingo came to be constructed in the Americas, scholars have seen the practice as an extension of building habits in peninsular Spain, where such works continued to be produced after the fall of Granada in 1492. The transatlantic movement of the form has sometimes been discussed in terms of the problematic and vague mechanism of stylistic influence, but it has also been explained through a materialist lens as the result of training and practice of both immigrant and native carpenters in the Americas. In addition, the circulation in the 17th century of architectural treatises on certain techniques of carpentry and construction, such as this one by Diego López de Arenas, are thought to have further facilitated the transmission of knowledge about how to construct these works. Related to this line of investigation about how these and other Islamic-looking forms were constructed in the Americas is the question of why they were built there. Again, scholars have proposed a variety of answers to this question, and none of them is mutually exclusive. It has been suggested, for example, that the prevalence of ornamented ceilings like the one at Santo Domingo may have to do with the abundance of wood in certain parts of Latin America, or to the existence of a tradition of wooden roof and ceiling construction prior to Spanish colonization, or to a belief that such structures were the most suitable kinds for areas prone to earthquakes. Others view these works through what Cynthia Robinson has called the fascination lens and the triumphalist lens. That is, some have seen them as a result of an aesthetic and technical fascination on the part of their patrons and makers, while others see them as the carriers of symbolic associations of victory and defeat in a struggle between Christians and non-Christians. These are all reasonable answers to the questions that have been posed. But I would argue that the questions themselves, that is, the questions of how and why these forms came to be built in the Americas, derive from art history's intense focus on the search for formal and iconographic sources, as well as on a problematic model for the transmission of knowledge in early modernity, in which ideas and artistic forms move in just one direction, from east to west, from peninsular Spain to the Americas. As such, the historiography runs the risk of obscuring the complex and multi-directional circulation of concepts and aesthetic options in the Hispanic world, a phenomenon that's being increasingly recognized in the art historical literature. In this paper, then, I want to think instead about this ceiling and other related forms as elements in a transatlantic, multi-directional dialogue centered on the visual culture of Andalusia and North Africa that emerged in early modern Latin America. The importance of these places in the imaginary of the early modern Hispanic world derives in large part from their status as sites of political and religious conflict at a time when territorial expansion and religious conversion were priorities for the Spanish monarchy. My analysis focuses on a corpus of texts and images produced in various parts of the Spanish Empire that are the artifacts of this dialogue. In keeping with the theme of the conference, the concept of color is a leitmotif in my analysis. By examining the ideological foundation on which this dialogue takes shape, the paper contributes to the history of Spanish colonialism, but at the same time, it provides a telling example of what Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom have called the legacy of Islamic art, and which might also be described as part of the history of the reception of Islamic art and culture in early modernity. I begin by examining some passages from early 16th century texts in which Spanish authors make comparisons between, on the one hand, people, places, and things they see in the Americas, with, on the other hand, what those authors conceive of as their counterparts in Andalusia and North Africa, and indeed other parts of the world. One such passage appears in the letter of 1519 from the newly formed town council of Veracruz on the Gulf Coast of Mexico to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The council members described the native inhabitants of the region in this way. They are of medium height with well-proportioned bodies and features, and the clothes they wear are like very colorful almayzares. The men cover their shameful parts, and on the upper part of their bodies, they wear very thin cloaks adorned like Moorish alquiceles. The use of Arabic names here to refer to certain articles of clothing is to a degree ideologically indeterminate, I think. For the headdresses called almayzares and the capes called alquiceles were worn by people of various religious convictions in the 15th and 16th centuries, according to clothing and costume historians. The author's description of the almayzares as very colorful, which is one way to interpret the phrase muy pintados, though is potentially of interest. As Michael Tausig observes in his book, What Color is the Sacred? Color tends toward invisibility in its verbal depictions. This phenomenon manifests itself in the 16th century chronicles of Spanish conquest in that individual colors are not frequently identified. More common, though, is the use of the term muy pintado or muy pintado de muchos colores, phrases that suggest colorfulness without suggesting specific colors such as red, yellow, or blue. In this way, such a description might be seen as an example of what Tausig calls the unstable mix of attraction and repulsion to color that, in his words, owes more than a little to the Western experience of colonization. Similar comparisons occur in texts produced by other Spaniards in other parts of the Americas. Miguel de Estete, an eyewitness to the fall of Inca Peru who recorded those events in a chronicle in the 1530s or 40s, described the Inca king named Atahualpa as wearing a crown and being seated on a small seat very low to the ground, like the Turks and Moors are accustomed to sit. He also describes a ritual performed by native Peruvians at the sacred center of Pachacamac as a familiar kind of pilgrimage. All of Atahualpa's subjects went there, he wrote, just as the Moors and Turks go to the house of Mecca. As scholars have observed, the orientalizing claims that the clothing, ritual practices and architecture of the native people of the Americas were similar to their so-called Moorish or Turkish counterparts. This is the terminology that tends to be used in the text. That it's not necessarily evidence of formal similarities that the modern observer today would recognize, but rather may be better understood as indications of their authors' experiences in late 15th and early 16th century Spain. That is, the authors were Christians who came out of a tradition which, as Barbara Fuchs has recently put it, quote, retained and celebrated the culture of Al-Andalus. It is, however, impossible to ignore the larger context in which the passages were penned and its relationship to conflict, as well as to intimacy, celebration, and fascination between Christians and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula. Another way to read this rhetoric, then, is through Robinson's agonistic lens, or triumphalist lens, as an attempt to liken the native inhabitants of early 15th century Mexico and Peru with conquered Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. In this way, the falls of the Aztec and Inca empires are equated with the fall of Granada to Christian Spaniards in the late 15th century. Passages like these in the letters of Cortes and the town council of Veracruz and the Chronicle of Estete lend themselves to both kinds of interpretations, and their complexity suggests that their authors do not regard aesthetic interest in a culture as incompatible with the desire to politically dominate that culture. And so here, I think the fascination lens and the triumphalist lens come together into a single point of view. This effect comes to the fore in the letters of Hernan Cortes, the Spaniard who took the Aztec capital to Charles V, the king in whose name he claimed it. In his second letter to the king, he describes the central Mexican town of Tlaxcala, whose inhabitants would ultimately ally themselves with the Spaniards. It is, he wrote, much larger than Granada and very much stronger, having very good buildings, and it contains a great many more people than Granada did when it was taken. Cortes mentions the Andalusian town again in his colorful description of the market in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. There are different kinds of spun cotton in threads of many colors, and it seems like the silk market at Granada, although there is a much greater quantity. They sell as many colors for painters as may be found in Spain, and all of excellent hues. References to colorfulness here and elsewhere in the corpus of early 16th century texts heighten the sense that the authors actually saw the things about which they write, and this was, of course, desirable in the writing of chronicles in this period. But in the passage, colorfulness is textually linked to the concept of abundance, an effect that might be seen as part of the author's self-fashioning as a model conquistador, boasting about the significance of his spoils. But at the same time, these comparisons demonstrate the complex play of similarity and difference that pervades the discourse of colonial encounter in early modernity. Aztec Tenochtitlan and its market, Cortes suggests, are similar to that of Granada, but they are even larger and more colorful, so he claims. Underlying this comparison, of course, is another unstated similarity. The Aztecs, like the Muslims of Granada, were not Christians. In other passages, the conceptual ties that bind the fall of Granada to that of Aztec Tenochtitlan are presented not through the rhetorical device of simile, but rather through something closer to catachresis or misidentification. Or again, that's the way it seems to the modern reader. Cortes describes the central Mexican town of Cholula in this way. It is even more beautiful when seen from afar than the cities in Spain because it is flat and dotted with towers. And I certify to your highness that from the mosque where I was standing, I counted over 400 towers in the city, and all of them belong to mosques. It's difficult to know with any certainty what the buildings Cortes saw looked like, but it is likely that they were, like other central Mexican ceremonial structures in the early 16th century, stepped pyramidal constructions with prominent cornice-like horizontal ornaments, and staircases. And so here I'm showing some reconstruction drawings and photographs of reconstructions of buildings. This one happens to be in Cholula, precisely the place from which Cortes said he was writing. There are many other references to mosques, in quotation marks, in the letters of Cortes, and the term also appears throughout other descriptions of Aztec Mexico and Inca Peru, when their authors are describing religious or ceremonial architecture of Native American cultures. The appearance of the term in these texts was of interest to the earliest scholars writing about them, and it has continued to incite comment in the more recent literature. Today, as in the earlier analyses, the substitution has been seen as a function of their authors' experience in peninsular Spain, where some sacred buildings that were not Christian churches were described as mosques. Indeed, one hypothesis suggested by the passage is that this type of building is not being recognized for its form, but rather for its sacred but not Christian function. If we redirect our analysis away from the mental worlds of the Spanish authors who were writing about the things they saw in the Americas, though, we can begin to ask what impact these comparisons and substitutions had on the readers of the texts. And in so doing, we begin to see these rhetorical maneuvers as part of a complex discourse on the culture of Andalusia and North Africa that circulated in the early modern Hispanic world. Many of the reports produced in the first years of Spanish colonialism in the Americas were published in the 16th century. Among the earliest to be printed was the second letter of Cortes, the same one in which he described the sacred architecture of the Aztec Empire as mosques. Through these and other publications like them, here I'm showing the title page of the first edition of the letters published in 1522 in Sevilla. Through these and other publications, comparisons between the native people of the Americas and the inhabitants of the Islamic world were conveyed back to Western Europe and were disseminated. It is difficult to know how those who printed and read the texts with their comparisons between the native people in the Americas and Muslims might have responded to them. Recent work by Elizabeth Wright on the Cortes letter, however, provides a model for how such an investigation might be undertaken. While the various 16th century editions of the letter reproduced the text faithfully, or in some cases translated it into another language, the illustrations that accompanied them varied by the publisher. The imagery that individual printers selected to complement the text then can be seen as an interpretation of that text, and an analysis of the imagery provides a fleeting glimpse of its reception by an albeit small community of readers. The illustration that accompanied the 1524 edition of the Cortes letter published in Nuremberg, seen here, the title page on the left and the map on the right, is, I think, particularly telling because it suggests that the author's textual comparison between the Aztec world and the Islamic world caught the attention of at least some of those readers. The illustration in question is a map that purports to represent Tenochtitlan, the sacred center of the Aztec Empire that Cortes and his followers invaded, captured, and settled in the 1520s. So here I'm talking about this part of the map. A number of these maps survive, and here I'm showing what I think is visually the most interesting one, a map in the collection of the Newberry Library in Chicago. And like many early modern prints, it has been brightly painted. Scholars agree that the image was probably made by a woodblock cutter in Nuremberg whose name is not known, and their analysis of it has focused on the sources that the artist may have consulted in making it. They've pointed out, for example, its relationship to the written description of the Aztec capital that accompanied it in the 1524 publication, as well as to the concept of the ideal Renaissance city and the conventions of both Native American and European cartography. This image, or this part of it, at least this part of it on the right, reminds me of some of the world maps that Lawrence Nees showed yesterday, and indeed the scholarship on this image has examined some of those similarities between this and world maps. The map depicts on the left the Gulf of Mexico, so that's this section of the image, and on the right the Aztec capital, city of Tenochtitlan, as an island, thus in keeping with Cortes' description of it as, quote, built on a salt lake with 4 causeways leading to it. At the center of the island city is a precinct containing a temple pyramid, right? there, a sacrificial platform, and a rack for the display of human skulls. That part is right there. Structures that are documented by Cortez as well as other colonial period texts and images, and whose presence at the center of Tenochtitlan has been verified archaeologically. Surrounding the rectilinear temple precinct are buildings resembling those in European towns in the nearly contemporary illustrations in the Nuremberg Chronicle of the 1490s, just 30 years before the publication of this image. So here I'm referring to these structures. But among the structures, which scholars have described in a very general way as European, are towers topped with bulbous domes. And so here I'm showing a detail from one part of the image. There's no evidence that the Aztec capital included such buildings. Rather, it would seem that the map maker has projected a kind of architecture from elsewhere in the world into his conceptualization of the space of Tenochtitlan. Might these structures then be conventionalized representations of Islamic architecture? Some of them generally resemble, for example, structures in a representation of Jerusalem in the Nuremberg Chronicle. The identification of the structures in the Cortez map in this way is further supported by the text that accompanies one of them. So this is the detail that I'm showing here, located directly to the west of the main double temple in the sacred precinct. It is labeled with a text that reads, "Temple for Prayer." One wonders then if the towers were conceived by the map maker as minarets, and thus if the map might be read as a visual translation of Cortez' description of a central Mexican landscape populated with, in his words, over 400 towers, all of them belonging to mosques. When they are considered as material objects rather than as intangible data, the Cortez letters demonstrate the emergence and circulation of a discourse on what, in a very general sense, could be called Islamic architecture. This discourse I'm suggesting is perhaps not most accurately viewed as the product of an amorphous Spanish or Islamic influence, but rather is produced in the Americas in the form of the letters and moves in the form of ink on paper across the Atlantic from west to east. Following this same trajectory from the Americas to Europe is an intriguing object that demonstrates another aspect of the circulation of knowledge and forms in the early modern Hispanic world. The object is an adarga, or small lobed shield, made in Mexico in the later 16th century, and today held in the collection of the Royal Armory in Madrid. Nearly all of the scholarship on this work notes that the Spanish word adarga derives from an Arabic word for shield, and that this type of armament was introduced to peninsular Spain from North Africa in the 13th century. On this object, however, the link to the history of conflict between Spanish Christians and Muslims is made even more explicitly in the complex and colorful imagery that appears on its face. A decorative band with vegetal motifs and grotesques adorns the edges, and at the center, two crowned birds, possibly herons, storks, or cranes, depending on who is writing about this, defend their nest against an advancing winged serpent. So that's this section. Above them is a medallion adorned with a text which can be translated as, "There is only one hope for old age." This, by the way, is a line from a poem in Latin by Thomas More. The surrounding area is divided into 4 parts, each one depicting a battle scene. Beginning in the upper left, their subjects are Las Navas de Tolosa, the fall of Granada, the expedition to Tunis, as it is sometimes called, and the Battle of Lepanto. And Maribel's presentation just a few minutes ago makes me wonder whether I might think a little bit more about the standards and the colors of the standards that are being carried in these images. The pictures are, in fact, mosaics made by attaching pieces of colorful bird feathers to the surface of the shield. This technique was widely used by Aztec artists prior to the arrival of Cortez and his followers in Mexico, and it is described and illustrated in a later 16th century codex produced by native painters and scribes near Mexico City. So here I'm showing the text that describes the technique and different stages of making a feather mosaic and then the object in question here again on the right. It's clear that feather mosaic works attracted the attention of the first Spaniards in Mexico. Works in this medium are mentioned by Cortés in early shipping inventories, and museum provenance data show that Aztec period objects made with these materials and techniques were collected in the early 16th century. Few of them survive. One that has is this feather mosaic shield with a hieroglyphic representation of warfare that today is held in the Museum for Ethnology in Vienna. And here I tried to get a detail of that to take a look at the technique and the medium. Works in this medium continue to be produced by native Mexicans in the colonial period, as evidenced by the shield that we have been examining, the imagery of which dates it to the later 16th century. The mosaic, the colors of the mosaic today are not indicative of its vivid and probably shiny appearance in the 16th century, and the feathers used on it have not been identified, but other works that have been analyzed more completely use the feathers of blue cotinga, scarlet macaw, yellow oriole, and rose spoonbill, and my apologies to the translator for that. This shield attests to the complexities of the circulation of knowledge and objects in the early modern Hispanic world, and at the same time, the production of a discourse in the early modern Americas about military conflicts between Spanish Christians and Muslims on and around the Iberian Peninsula. Here, native Mexicans used traditional American materials and techniques to display images of Spanish Christians fighting Muslims on a type of object whose origins, the adarga itself, whose origins lie in the Islamic world. Although the circumstances surrounding the production of this are not known, evidence suggests that it was sent across the Atlantic as a gift to Philip II of Spain. Here I was reminded that the concept of colorful things as gifts has surfaced in a number of the presentations today, and I was thinking especially about Shreve Simpson's mention yesterday of the shipping of an enormous quantity of cochineal as a gift. What kinds of ideas would this object have brought to mind in later 16th century Madrid? It's likely that the use of the feather mosaic technique would have suffused it with ideas of preciousness and perhaps exoticness. But did it, like certain passages in the letters of Cortés and his contemporaries, suggest comparisons between the Aztec and Islamic worlds? Is the fall of Aztec Tenochtitlan here to be understood as similar to the fall of Granada and the other historical episodes depicted on the shield? What is so fascinating about this object that it is on its surface that such comparisons emerge that on its surface, such comparisons emerge through the object's materiality, that is, through its use of colorful feathers as materials, and the conditions of its production by native Mexicans rather than by Spaniards. In this way, it can be seen as a brilliant riposte to the Cortés letters, an image of Spanish military victory in a faraway place that comes from the hands of people whose land had been conquered in the not-so-distant past. Alternate readings of the object, however, are also possible. The comparison between the defeat of the Aztec Empire and the so-called reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, of course, depended upon the fiction that the fall of Granada marked the end of the conflict between Spaniards and Muslims. As history shows, and as the shield illustrates, that conflict continued into the later 16th century and beyond, a circumstance that is perhaps recognized by the inscription's reference to the monarchy's future. But regardless of what kind of messages the shield conveyed, it demonstrates one retelling of history that emerged and circulated in this world. And like the writings of Cortés, this facet of that discourse was produced in the Americas and moved from west to east against the currents, as it were, of the modern historiographic tradition. One of the centers for the production of mosaics like this one was a Franciscan monastery complex in Mexico City called San José de los Naturales, or St. Joseph of the Natives. The complex, which is no longer extant, is believed to have been the first of many such centers in the Americas, built to serve as sites for the conversion of native peoples to Christianity. In addition to a chapel and a monastery, the complex also included a structure architectural historians call a capilla de Indias, an Indian chapel. This was a partially enclosed structure that served as the setting for religious instruction and ritual, and which would become a standard feature of many monastic complexes in early colonial Mexico. The chapel in Mexico City, which was constructed by native laborers, was built in the mid-16th century and modified in the decades that followed. It was later destroyed, and its plan is thus only known from contemporary texts, which describe it as consisting of 7 naves supported by columns and opening into an atrium planted with trees. In his influential book, Mexican Architecture of the 16th Century of 1948, George Kubler published reconstructed plans and an elevation of the building, which I show you on the screen now. He estimated its size as 70 meters wide and 30 meters deep, and compared it to, in his words, a Moorish mosque. No description of the building by a 16th century observer, however, made such an association, thus raising questions about the kind of symbolism this structure would have conveyed to its contemporary observers. It's clear that it was a hypostyle hall that in some ways resembles the plan of mosques that may have been known to 16th century Spaniards. The Indian chapel of San Jose in Mexico City was unusual in comparison with other chapels constructed in 16th century Mexico, but it was not unique. A similar plan would be employed in Cholula, the place from which Cortes wrote about having seen mosques, and was also built by native labor. Today it appears in a transformed state, so I'm showing a photograph of what this looks like if you visit it today. But an image from a late 16th century map shows an open facade with 5 arched bays. So here the idea is that those have been closed. Reconstructions based on documentary evidence present a slightly different vision of its appearance in the late 16th century. And these ornaments, I should add, still exist, so they aren't fanciful inventions of the person who made the reconstruction. Modern scholarship consistently compares this building to the Mosque of Córdoba, but as with the Chapel of San Jose at Mexico City, one might reasonably ask whether a structure like that one was a point of reference for the designers of the buildings, or if, instead, it was simply a point of reference for early 20th century art historians trying to make sense of the often vague descriptions of buildings. But the similarity between the chapel in Cholula and its alleged Andalusian prototype was recognized at least by 1630, when the Jesuit priest Bernabé Cobo described the building in a letter as, quote, in the style of the Mosque of Córdoba. So the important thing here is that at least some early modern observers made the connection. It's not clear whether the building would have, whether that connection would have made it. It certainly would not have been made by all of the people who viewed it. And to conclude, it's in the same period, that is the late 16th century and early 17th century, that the earliest of the ornamented and polychromed ceilings, often called mudéjar, were built in Latin America. These forms, like the feather adarga and the 16th century hypostyle halls in Mexico City and Cholula, may or may not have evoked ideas about a vaguely defined, visually stunning Islamic world for their early modern viewers. They did, however, evoke such ideas for their earliest interpreters in the field of art and architectural history. But for the 21st century viewer, they are perhaps better seen as the cosmopolitan artifacts of a cultural area that took shape in early modernity on both the eastern and western shores of the Atlantic. As I have suggested in this paper, the formal and ideological dimensions of that cultural area take shape in the complex social life of the feather mosaic shield, in the intricate carpentry and polychromy of the Santo Domingo ceiling, in the plan of the chapel at Cholula, and in the evocative phrase, threads of many colors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think you've made it quite clear that in order to investigate the role of color in Islamic culture, we not only have to go beyond art history to history and philosophy, but that we have to go geographically beyond the Islamic lands to colonial North and South America, Central America. So do we have a couple of questions before lunch? Yes, over here in the... Yes.
Michael, I really enjoyed your talk. I think it's such
Thank you.
an exciting area to explore, and I'm just so happy you're delving into this. The last two images, the plans for the building San Jose and the other one, what are the dates that they were constructed in Mexico?
The plans that I showed are from the later 16th century, and the construction history, which has been put together through documents and I think is probably debatable, would probably give the dates of maybe 1550s to 1600. And so the images that the people writing about these buildings have selected as the example of what the building looks like is when it, to them, looked most like a mosque, I think, at some period in the later 16th century. Maybe I would say 1570s or 1580s.
I mean, I think one of the most interesting areas, especially Mexico or New Spain, in this period, and it's still an area to explore, and the images that you chose or the subjects you chose have brought it up for me when I was thinking, is you mentioned Cortés and Cortés's letters, but the viceroy that follows Cortés, which is the most interesting to many people, Antonio de Mendoza, grew up in basically the back door of the Alhambra. His family were very knowledgeable about Islamic practice. They were very supportive of this. They were the intellectuals of Spain. And he goes to Mexico City, and it would be in his reign that this was constructed. So I would just find it curious about Antonio's support, involvement, his attitude, because he would certainly be very knowledgeable and very conscious of this being a plan or reminiscent of a mosque. So.
Yeah, thanks. In looking at this plan and in thinking about it, I've been struck by some of the similarities between what's at stake here and what we've been talking about with color, because here is an architectural form that had some significance to someone like Antonio de Mendoza and also to, I suppose, Cortés describing buildings as mosques. So that was the point of reference, but one way to pursue this, I think, would be to look into pre-Columbian building traditions as well and to think about the hypostyle hall as a form that already was in existence there. So here's an architectural form that has different associations to different audiences at the same time in the same place. But I agree, Antonio de Mendoza would be really interesting to look into for this. Thank you.
Mr. SCHERFFLER, thank you very much for your... I could say that I came here for your lecture, but I must explain. First of all, because I have nothing to do with Islamic culture, I have a bit to do with, in my studies, with Mexico. I have far more to do with Gaudí, Antonio Gaudí, the Spanish architect, who was very much influenced by by Mayan architecture, actually, which is in my thesis. So nobody here will know it because it's a totally different field. But I think we need the assistance of Mrs. Fierro as being Spanish, because I would like to go into a few details concerning the letters by Cortés, in which he mentioned a few things, and the translations of it. Because he's talking about, he's writing about, if I understand it correctly, about ciudad llana y torreada, con muchas torres, and you translate, or it is translated into English, with many towers, but there were no towers at all. As far as I know, there were about 2 towers in pre-Columbian Mexico. One was in Palenque. So I think this is a question I have. What did you see? And then I would like to add that since Cortés came from southeastern Spain, as far as I know, that the only comparison that he could make was or Christian, his culture, or mosque.
Right, yeah, I agree with you completely. And one of the things that has attracted me to looking at these texts is reading them and reading about things that are presented as being objectively true, such as the description of towers, and then the archaeological knowledge that that can't be right, or that archaeologists today don't think that that's right. And so that's what's really fascinating about these texts, and to think about the way that description itself is a representation, one that might not represent precisely the way we would see it today. And that's what I find interesting about these. That's where I think the ideological dimension comes out.
Can I add just more in general? This is a problem that we have with descriptions, old descriptions, that we cannot, well, you know, the knowledge that those people had. So also, I mean, talking about colors then, and the way that they, I saw a few, in the former lectures, I saw a few sentences about, like, you know, using the yellow and the blue, and that they paint them themselves. And then we come to this problem, the translation from one language into another, and the knowledge that people have then, and the knowledge that we...
Right, no, absolutely, I agree, and it points out how texts are different kinds of representations than images are, or the way that we can, they provide different kinds of historical information. That to me is fascinating.
Did you want to say something, Jonathan, about towers?
Yeah, I found it a wonderfully stimulating presentation, and I was really struck by this last question, because just by calling, and this takes us away from color to something else, I think, but just by calling it a tower, you're thinking of that our author is referring to something like the minaret of the mosque here in Cordova across the street, which is a very tall tower. But if you turn the other direction and go down to the city walls, we have something else that's also called a tower, which is really not much higher than the building. It's the walls themselves, a sort of short and squat structure. So, I mean, this is probably more a question of understanding the vocabulary of Cortes and what he meant, whether there are two words in Spanish for, you know, one tall one or just a short one. And there I defer to you.
Right, and I agree with you that it's a very complex thing to do, to look at these texts and to think about the meanings of individual words. When I present this material and other material about texts, the questions are often of this sort about translation. I think it really does go to a bigger question about how complex these representations are. But thank you, I'll look into that.
Hi, just a very quick question. Is it possible to situate the discourse about natives in Latin America adjacent to the existing discourse in Spain about the difficulty of domesticating, the ability to, well, the domesticated architecture and architectural styles, but the inability to domesticate the leftover Muslims and the resultant expulsion of them. Because in a lot of discourse you find express the difficulty of domesticating them and ultimately turning them into a radical other that can't be domesticated and therefore expelled. But the ability to domesticate and therefore convert the natives, especially the existing contemporary debates on whether the natives had souls or not, or whether they can be converted or not, and the permission from the Pope and all that kind of stuff. But then the projection onto these Morisco-like, Moorish-like people.
Yes.
This, you know.
One of the reasons I became interested in this project is having read some work by literary scholars, and I'm especially thinking about Barbara Fuchs, whose book Exotic Nation, and another one, Mimesis and Empire, deals with precisely these issues, and looking at texts that describe and make comparisons between the Americas and other parts of the world. So I was looking for a visual record, or a way to talk about some of these same issues by using visual evidence or texts that evoke visuality in some way. And so I'm trying to get it at from a slightly different perspective, but I think it's the same issue.
Well, I I think on that note, we should note that there are many diverse things to do today, and one of them is lunch. Could I remind you all that we are going to reconvene at 2:30, so we have an hour and a half, but that goes quickly with our long lunch. The bookstall will be open just through lunch, so you're going to have to fit in lunch too, but I hope to see you all back here at 2:30. And thank you again, Michael, and all of our speakers this morning. Thank you for your work.